Good morning, everybody. Well, it's Groundhog Day again, or something like that. Um, Back at the Kennedy Space Center press site, um, 10 hours later. And so I think the it wasn't necessarily self-evident at the end of the test last night, but within a couple of hours after I'd gone to bed, the uh, NASA leadership announced that they were going to push back the earliest opportunity to launch Artemis 2 until launch period 18, which hopefully you can see here on the screen. Let me know if you can hear me okay too. Um, and so we'll get more details at a news conference, uh, which is currently scheduled for 1 p.m. here local Eastern time. I believe that would be 1800 UTC. The But I thought I would go just sort of quickly run through for those of you, I guess, whether or not you watched a lot of live stream yesterday from here during the first couple of hours of the tanking process, and then over on the NSF live stream or other live streams that were covering the wet dress rehearsal yesterday. The um, So yes, the question is March is confirmed. So there's not enough time to resolve the issues that came up during the wet dress rehearsal yesterday. The main one, the two main ones, and I guess it's sort of 1A and sort of one or maybe 2A or two. They saw hydrogen concentrations in the liquid hydrogen tail service mast umbilical, again in that cavity between the vehicle side umbilical plate and the ground side umbilical plate, um, way above, well, that's not true, above the upper limit for hydrogen. That umbilical cavity is purged with gaseous helium because it's a hydrogen umbilical, and then there's a vent port, and they are basically sampling the atmosphere coming out of that vent port, and it should be almost completely helium. And there's an upper limit to how much the hydrogen concentration you can measure. This is part of a hazardous gas detection system, and the so they registered, uh, at least from what I'm hearing, they registered levels that were up above the upper limit. It doesn't sound like they were um, hugely above the limit, but the other thing that I'd heard yesterday was that they had actually bumped the upper limit up from Artemis 1, and so the it's there's a lot of context that we're missing this morning, but they had to they had to stop flow for liquid hydrogen. And again, this was interesting, and I mentioned it on the NSF live stream yesterday when I was on. They During Artemis 1, when they ran into leaks at this umbilical interface, they typically would run into them early in the loading process. So they begin slow fill and they begin fast fill, and those are basically just different flow rates through the fill and drain line in the umbilical. It's a quick disconnect between the plates. And during Artemis 1, typically they were seeing that hydrogen concentration go above the upper limit early in the fast fill process. Yesterday, what they saw was, at least as far as we know, was they saw they did not see a violation until they were over 50% full in the liquid hydrogen tank of the core stage. So, but given some of this other information that's sort of trickling out, which is that they'd adjusted the upper limit, increased it again between Artemis 1 and Artemis 2, it certainly adds to the list of questions. So they 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 violated the limit. They stopped flow. They did a sort of a standard troubleshooting procedure, which is to let the interface between the seals. I think they say that they use a Teflon seal between the quick disconnect. And again, I was sort of likening it to like an Indy car when they come into the pits, that connection that they plug into the fuel tank there. It's something like that where it you you have to it has to quickly disconnect when they get the liftoff signal or the launch release signal. So um, the they stopped flow. They let the interface warm up a little bit, and hoping that that would seal. They resumed flow again sometime later, and because and again that was kind of one of the big takeaways. I don't know that it was terribly surprising yesterday given what happened, but the the amount of awareness we had of what was going on for that sort of 14 hours between the go for tanking around 11:30. um, that was an hour behind when we were expecting it. So maybe going back to about this time yesterday until around 12:30. So after midnight last night, um, when things there were a lot of periods of just dead air, no posts, no nothing. There were a couple times I think where we went up to like 90 minutes between updates, and so it was unfortunately not a total surprise, but the they resumed flow and then had to stop again. And I don't know that we know that much about what they did at that point, whether they repeated the troubleshooting procedure or did something else or a combination of those things. But they were then able to um, complete the loading and get into a lower flow. They go from fast fill back down to topping when the the full sensors up at the top of the liquid hydrogen tank, when the level gets up to those points then and covers those sensors up, then you get a 98% full. You go into topping, then you get to 100%, and then you go into replenish, which is a slightly lower flow rate. But I think the question that came up relatively quickly was, okay, you can manage the hydrogen concentrations, but if you're right on the margin there or right on the edge of your upper limit, what happens in terminal countdown when you pressurize the liquid hydrogen tank and um, and then you go into, I think what's called it's called the drain back, and so you have an increased flow rate through the umbilical interface. Again, another one of the questions that was never we never got a distinction about was there are two relatively large lines in the liquid hydrogen tail service mast umbilical. There's a fill and drain line, which is 8 inches in diameter, and then there's a bleed line. Um, Fill and drain for loading is going into the vehicle. The bleed line is coming out of the vehicle, but you're still the those seals and the if there is an issue with either of those, you'll pick up that hydrogen concentration in the umbilical cavity there between the two plates. So we didn't really get any distinction between whether they were seeing the leak um, when they had activity going through both lines, whether it was going through one line or the other. But that I think was I think what we were wondering what would happen is when they get to T minus 6 minutes in the countdown, that's the go for core stage tank pressurization. And they don't another distinction they don't make with that GLS milestone is which one goes first. It's the liquid hydrogen tank that they close the vent valve and begin pressurizing the tank um, a couple of seconds after T minus 6 minutes. And so what we saw last night was we actually saw a surprise. I don't know if this is a GLS milestone or not, but this was a unknown stopping point in the countdown at T minus 5 minutes and 15 seconds. And so they probably saw if they were bumping up against the upper limit in replenish flow, then they probably saw that violation relatively quickly after they passed through the T minus 5 minute 57 second point, and they close the vent valve, start pressurizing the tank. You get into liquid hydrogen drain back. Um, and so thinking about that sequence again, there was the closeout crew left the pad. Uh, there was another long pause between the point where the closeout crew left the pad and came back to the roadblock and when they picked up the count at T minus 10 minutes. And another one of those questions that I'm wondering about is um, they probably had, well, I'm speculating, but I'm speculating that they had a long discussion before they picked up the count about what was going to happen when they got to this point in the terminal count. So I don't know that this was necessarily a huge surprise to them that they had to hold and then that they had to cut off and recycle, and then that was the end of the day. So it's a little bit, but that's what we heard about. Well, we didn't necessarily hear about that right away, but then in the release that they put out, and I think it was, the public affairs folks. I was one of the last people out of here that wasn't working with public affairs, but then a lot of them were obviously still here for another couple of hours because I think this was posted. Um, Let me go back and see. Yeah, this was posted at just about 2 a.m. this morning. And one of the other things that was mentioned in this was that the closeout crew, they, they had a few, they had a few, um, they had an issue with, hmm, but they had some issues in the closeout process that they probably want to. This will give them some additional time um, uh, to look into, similar to what they're going to have to do with pardon me, whatever they're dealing um, with the tail service mast, this quick disconnect connection between the tail service mast ground side plate and the flight side plate on the core stage engine section. Um, so I think the near term, what we know at this point is it sounds like they're going to do another wet dress rehearsal. I don't know that they really spelled out exactly what they need to do before they conduct another wet dress rehearsal. Um, I don't know that they said, I don't know that they explicitly said that they're going to stay at the pad, but I think it's highly unlikely that if they were to roll back, that they would have enough time to basically repeat what we just saw in January, which is roll back, make some set of changes, and then try and come back out, repeat the 2 weeks of countdown preps again, and um, do another wet dress rehearsal, and then quickly turn around and be ready for a first launch attempt. I think it's more likely that if they are going to stay with the March launch period, that I have up on the screen here, launch period 18, that they will they'll stay at the pad. I don't know whether I would assume that they're going to work on these issues first, and then at some point up again ahead of the launch period, they will need to essentially close the vehicle out again, and that's going to be where we would see the contingency pad access platforms lifted up into place, and um, they would go into the forward skirts of the two solid rocket boosters into the north side core stage inner tank access door, and do what I believe Artemis launch director Charlie Blackwell Thompson called an abbreviated flight termination system retest. They'll cover the pieces that they need to retest. So there's some uh, disconnecting of ordnance and putting in, they have to install breakout boxes and they have to hook things up to bypass the ordnance. You don't want to actually send the signal to the ordnance, and but that would in theory, they would do that later. They'd probably have more flexibility, but I think again we're making the assumption that if they're going to stick with this March window, which is, it seems like a long ways away, but again, if once you start looking at the math, um, it's going to take them 2 weeks if they when they get to the pad to prepare the vehicle for a countdown, as we just saw. Obviously, the weather didn't help, but I don't know that it really the 2 days that they got ahead by 2 days, and then the weather they lost those 2 days again for due to the weather. But I mean, they still worked really hard to get the vehicle ready for the tanking test um, as early as this last Saturday. But that still took a lot of work, and the uh, and so it would make sense unless some other thing comes up that would force them to roll back or make it the pros and cons of staying at the pad versus rollback would change. But yeah, as Anthony's saying, the I that's the way I take the fact that they're targeting March right now, is that they'll but I think that they're gonna do whatever repairs or whatever work that they need to do, hands-on work at the pad. But I think then the question is, what do they need to do uh, with, especially with the tail service mast umbilical? Do they need to disassemble it? This is very similar to the situation they were in after the two Artemis 1 launch attempts in late August and early September of 2022. So after the second attempt, they had a very similar um, issue that pushed them out of that launch period back in for that launch campaign, and they stayed at the pad. They disconnected the umbilical plates. They I don't know if they replaced the seals for the liquid hydrogen lines. There are other connections on the umbilical plate. Pardon me. Things like the gaseous helium purge. There are purges for there are purges for some of these uh, open volume, so to speak. I don't know that that's an open volume. It's a very tiny cavity closed volume, but they also they have electrical connections and so on. But they would, are they going to disconnect the plates, repair them, replace seals, and then remate them? But when they did that in September 2022, I think they had more work to do because they were still working through procedural changes, and it's possible we'll see something like that, but it might be a couple of weeks to turn around for another wet dress rehearsal. Um, but that still leaves you with a lot more time to deal with anything else you need to clean up after that wet dress rehearsal for um, for a possible launch opportunity. The earliest launch opportunity now would be March 6th at, well, again, we not actually we're going to run into the same thing that we did last time, which is um, again, it's the first launch opportunity is at essentially, what is that? Is it 8:30? I think 8:30. Yes. So approximately 8:30 p.m. Eastern on the night of March 6th, but it's 90 minutes after midnight in UTC. So either way, that's probably not something that's going to be that big of an issue right away. Right now, they have to figure out, they have to better understand what's going on. And I think that's obviously that's something that became very clear yesterday, is that they don't completely understand the behavior of this interface yet, and so that's going to be something that they're going to be working on. Uh, and we just have to see what the scope uh, of the work that they're considering. So um, so I guess I'll go ahead and stop there, because we'll find out more here midday, and see if I'll just see if there are any questions. But yes, the they're not going to. There's not enough time to deal with this issue, with the issues that they saw last night, and be ready even a week from now. And so the last opportunity they have in this launch period, in the February launch period, is the night of February 10th, and the launch window being um, after midnight on February 11th. But I mean, that basically means you would you're going to need to be in countdown by the evening of the 9th, and that only gives you one shot. So I don't, and I'm not, I don't think, I think the reason that they didn't even that they push it to March is they need more time than that for sure. So and so yeah, I think one of there's a number of questions about what this is, the way that this presented itself, at least based on how we were notified of it, seems different than what they saw on Artemis One, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is that it is as different as presented. Because again, out of the yesterday, we basically saw a very similar situation in terms of understanding what was going on and getting updates. So again, we just went for most of the time yesterday. We really were in the dark about what was happening, what the next steps were, and it was very difficult to understand what, um, just based on what we were being told yesterday, what was going on. So hopefully we'll get a little bit clearer picture of at least their understanding based on the data that they got yesterday. So but we don't know what they were seeing in terms of hydrogen concentrations through the entire uh, procedure, because I don't know that you don't necessarily want to be right, bumping up against the upper limit um, throughout. Ideally you would be more in the middle of the range, if there is a range. Um, I assume that there is, but I think that's it's. I think we do, as much as we just don't understand what they saw yesterday, and so that's why it's hard to tell what exactly what exactly their understanding is of it either. So um, yeah, it's frustrating being this much in the dark, but unfortunately, it wasn't a surprise, and we saw sort of the tempo of updates. Basically, we had a relatively steady stream of updates once they made the decision to tank, and then we were getting a relatively steady flow of updates as I was on the stream that I was doing yesterday, and then once they, it just pure coincidence, didn't have anything to do with it, but when I took that break after this one before I went on the NSF stream, is when we heard the first word of it, and then the updates basically died from that point forward, and we would get very sporadic updates, and that's similar to what happened with the wet dress rehearsals in back in the spring of 2022. Is it and I again, just a pet peeve of mine. I do not know what the advantage is of saying nothing, because it very quickly became clear that um, the lack of updates was not good. When we went from no news is good news very quickly to no news is bad news, and it really didn't change for the rest of the day and the rest of the night. So um, I don't and I I'll be I will not be surprised if we have basically the same setup for the next wet dress rehearsal, and you know we're that's going to play out again as well. We'll see, but um, there were the I'd say that the biggest pauses and dead air that were the most frustrating were obviously when they stopped flow in the sort of early to mid afternoon. But then when the closeout crew came back to the roadblock here, there there was almost an hour where they were likely discussing something, and uh, before they picked the count up and made that made the abbreviated terminal countdown run. And I just it would have been, I think, unfortunately their policy sort of prohibits them from talking about that, but it would have been nice to have been given some idea at that time of day that, because we're talking about, I think the closeout crew got back to the roadblock somewhere around 11 p.m. and they didn't pick up. I think the targeted T0 that they ended up shooting for was like 12:19 a.m. Eastern. So there was a long time there where I think they were discussing, again, I'm speculating, but I think they were discussing what's going to happen. And I would not be surprised if they sort of knew going into this, that there was a high likelihood that they were going to they weren't going to be able to complete the terminal countdown sequence. So um, and it did get yeah, it was interesting. So it's we're the temperatures are rebounding here. So um, I think we got down to right around freezing, but then the once the sun came up this morning, we went up into the mid 40s, and it went up into the mid 50s. It's probably going to get up possibly over 60 degrees here. So it's like after temperatures were in the mid 20s for a few days, it I think it's possible that some of the cameras were sort of getting worn out by the temperature swings, or just being cold for extended periods of time and then getting a little warm up and then getting cold again. And some of the equipment, it didn't necessarily fail right away, but the the this that and the wind, there was a lot of wind too. So it'll be interesting to there are some other things that they need to work on. But then I think it's probably, well, it is, it's less likely that you're going to see that type of weather pattern in late February, early March down here. But then now you could probably start to be, you could, there could be a higher chance of um, severe weather, that type of thing down here in that time frame. So there probably will be weather, but it might be a different type of weather that they have to deal with in the rest of this month and then into March. Could still see some cold temperatures for a while though. So, but we could also see. I would not be surprised if we start to see springtime weather and some of those uh, transitional activities, so to speak, like severe weather here, um, early, late winter could be is sort of a transition period. So um, yeah, the what we got here on site was, which was very helpful, at least in my mind, which is that they had a um, countdown clock feed here in the news center. And so um, I mean, I don't know that I agree with it, but I understand why the stream was using an L minus clock. Um, that's probably easier to understand for a larger audience, but the um, one of the things we saw in the terminal count was that the clock that they were using was not synchronized with the actual countdown clock. And so if you were watching, you saw, well, maybe the better way to put it is, here in the news center, um, we watch the clock pass through the T-6 minute point, and then we're watching very carefully to see if it continues. And we saw immediately when the clock held at T-5 minutes and 15 seconds, and then you can't hear anything. And at that point now, we would you would need to be able to hear to get hear something to get any sense of situational awareness. And so the only thing that we could really look for at that point was, um, okay, this sort of ends up being the unplanned hold test that they were doing, just at a different point in that period of time between t minus 6 minutes and t minus 1 minute 30 seconds. They only have about 3 minutes of unplanned hold capability, and so because the crew access arm had already been retracted, you would get a sign when they if they cut off and recycle, you would see the arm re-extended. And so basically that's what we saw. That was our cue that they'd cut off. But I don't know that that was a big surprise. It was just a question of, what when do we see that? So I think again, I think lot there was I was thinking that on the NSF stream last night, which was, can they even get through a terminal count sequence if they're right up against that upper limit? And so, it was, but it was still valuable to, without seeing the countdown clock, you wouldn't get that, you wouldn't have that situational awareness of, okay, they held, um, at 5 minutes 15 seconds. It took a few minutes longer for the feed to catch up to where the countdown clock was the whole time. And so we saw that the whole time here in the news center. And then um, so that was why that was valuable. But then the rest of it, yeah, we did not get. They're not going to. They're if in the name of sort of having a unified message, if that message is nothing, then that's basically what it was. So they weren't going to necessarily, and if you think about it, anything that they give in a sort of an out of band stream to media here is going to get reported. So they were just going to have a unified message of nothing, and so that's what we ended up with yesterday. Um, and so, but again, we did have that one little bit of um, situational awareness for terminal count because we could see the countdown clock. And throughout the NSF live stream, we were also trying to let the guys know, hey, we got to the planned holds on time, and all the way up to and including the hold at t minus 10 minutes. But again, you could see what was going to happen. Um, and one of the other things about last night that became obvious over time was how late they were, and that they given what happened, I don't know that they really would have even had a chance to make a launch attempt under those conditions. And so what happens, you're not going to turn around and repeat the process if without making any changes. And so it just didn't make any sense to, it there it, some of the choices that they've made in terms of punting on February make sense given what we saw last night. So I mean, my opinion as to why they weren't doing it, it will be, again, we'll see what happened, because this is the same pattern. It's a repeat of the pattern from Artemis 1, which is um, no nothing for the first couple of attempts, and then they provided um, sort of a middle ground of switched feeds and live commentary for the last wet dress rehearsal attempt. But that was after they had scrubbed, I think, 3 attempts, 2 in April, or maybe it was 3 in April. So, we'll see. We'll see what they're going to do now. But, um, you know, they were aware. They were aware 2.5 weeks ago when the vehicle rolled out to the pad that we would prefer less secrecy, I guess is the best way I would put it. Um, well, diplomatically. So I'll avoid extra adjectives right now. But So yeah, the question of what's the difference between L minus time and T minus time. I mean, um, I people are accustomed to it now because of the uh, the Falcon launches are so frequent and so routine now that and I believe Falcon is a system that basically just has an instantaneous window. So and they launch most of the time. And I think we talked about this on the NSF live stream that um, they just very frequently, and I was wondering because those guys cover all those launches, um, what the percentage is of launch attempts where they have a liftoff time, and they do have some flexibility with the Starlink launches where they can shift the start time essentially for the launch a few hours this way or that way based on the wind, the whatever plane that they're launching a particular group of satellites into. But once they begin fueling, then you're constrained to that. But um, typically, when you get into fueling for that vehicle, you just have your ignition and launch time. They count down to that and they launch. For pretty much the rest of the industry previously, and there's still a lot of heritage hardware and procedures in the industry. You have these planned holds in the countdown where that give you the ability to catch up a little bit, and we saw that yesterday before they got into the hydrogen issues that they didn't actually give the go for tanking until almost an hour after the sort of expected time, but then they very quickly caught up to the timeline, if not got ahead of the timeline um, with the fueling process. And so that's what the holds are for. And they had a 2 hour and 15-minute long hold at the beginning of tanking day, which and the reason that they do that is um, for something like that. They needed a little extra time to talk about what was about. Are they ready to go? But then they have time to catch up down the in the time after that. But the the but as I mentioned in the NSF stream yesterday as well, an L minus clock really just tells you how much time there is until a particular moment in time. And so yesterday, the L minus clock was really only telling you how long it was until 9 p.m. Eastern. It really wasn't giving you any additional information about where the countdown was, because there's those phases of the countdown where you have the first hold before the fueling phase. The second hold is before they start the Orion closeout phase of the tanking day, and then the last hold is before terminal count. Pardon me. And so those knowing when the clock was holding at least gives you a little bit of an idea about where they were. Um, and so the L minus clock, I don't know that it really tells you that. You can get away with that. Again, my opinion, you can get away with that if you're providing live commentary, because now you're providing people with you're letting people know what's happening right now, what's the next step, where you're giving them detailed situational awareness in real time. Then the L minus clock is just it gives you it's context. If it's not quite as effective when it's the only information it doesn't really it really serves it's really only serves as context. But if it's doesn't have any context if it's the only piece of information um, the question is did they get far enough so that a tanking test could be done rather than a wet dress rehearsal? That's an interesting question. I guess I get my sort of initial take on that would be no. Um, and I think the reason that they weren't able to get through the terminal count last night is because they had a leak that was uh, they had a leak that was too close to the limit. It wasn't big enough to completely stop them, and it allowed them get as far as they got last night. But I mean, I mentioned it in a reply to a post this morning. I mean, in order to launch, you don't just need to load the vehicle with propellant. You need to you need to be able to get all the way through terminal count without any major violations like that. So, um, I mean, I think the only way that you would be willing to call it a day and call it a good tanking test and not do a terminal countdown run would be if you were seeing the hydrogen concentrations, just sit in the middle of their range at way below the upper limit. Um, I guess it's possible that that would give them enough confidence, but it also seems like it would be a good idea, in my mind, to go ahead and run through the entire sequence, especially if you could do that, um, in a couple of weeks, and you would still have a couple of weeks. So again, mid February, um, you would still have more than a couple of weeks to make any additional adjustments that you might want to make. And so, um, I think in a way it's sort of the same type of philosophy that they employed last night, which was we may as well we may as well cover as much ground as we can, um, and because otherwise we're going to have to do this again anyway. So I think the problem is I don't know that anybody's going to be comfortable if the first time that they retest this is with the crew on board, um, and into terminal count, and just how much of a risk it is to, uh, it's not a safety risk. It's the risk of you're just giving yourself a lot of extra work that you need to do in terms of, going back out, getting the crew out of the vehicle. The crew has to go through the entire, um, quarantine process, and so I think you're in a way better off learning as much as you can as soon as you can. And so, um, in that sense, they did accomplish that yesterday, which was they this is about as soon as they could have done this test. And so even it's just that they put themselves in a position where, um, if it had gone successfully, they would have been ready to turn around and launch. And so the uh, but it does, again, as I mentioned, as I also mentioned on the NSF stream. Um, it is an interesting question because they did have the opportunity to do a tanking test last year with just SLS. They wouldn't have learned the lessons that they learned last night, um, with the Orion closeout, because you go out there without Orion at all. Um, but maybe they would have been able to do some of these procedures. In theory, they could have done, I believe, either in the VAB or even off-site, or in the, not necessarily in the launch abort system facility, but probably there may be other locations that they could have, and I'm sure that they've run through the sequence many times, but this was as high fidelity as possible. And I think they mentioned in there, again, the vehicle is being purged with nitrogen. It's a, you know there are the safety risks are higher, um, but it's, again, it's the type of situation that you want to get into where it gives you a high fidelity, um, simulation, if you want to call it that. But I mean, they're basically doing exactly the same thing that they would be doing on launch day. The only thing that was missing last night was the flight crew. Yeah, so just in terms of the sequence, by stopping when they stopped, so that, I'm assuming that T minus 5 minutes 15 seconds is the first hold point after they get past the, uh, core stage liquid hydrogen tank pressurization. And so then the other part of this that I think that was that you were asking, a little later, was um, why can't you mask that? I mean, if you think about what happened yesterday, they could not continue when the hydrogen concentration went above the violated the upper limit. So when the first time that happened, they stopped. They did their troubleshooting, resumed. It went over the limit again. They stopped again. Then they, when they resumed, I think the second time they were able to stay at least within limits, but they basically stopped every time they went over the limit, and so they never tried to bypass the limit yesterday, and so once you get into that, once you they stopped when they got into when they violated the limit in terminal count, and the problem is there's not really there isn't as much you can do. Um, you're when you get into terminal count, it narrows down your ability to do an extended troubleshooting sequence. So each time that those troubleshooting sequences, I think, include something like a half hour of just waiting for the interface to warm up. So um, I think the rule is that you can't continue unless you address the violation, and there really isn't anything that they could do to address the violation within the time there was left. So um, they weren't going to continue in that configuration um, because of again the downsides where if you really have a flammability risk, um, you can't control you don't have the hydrogen concentrations aren't necessarily just going to stay a little bit above the limit. They could continue to trend upwards. So yeah, it's just there are a lot of risks to bypassing uh, certain situations like what they saw last night. Again, just I guess to recap. Um, well, sort of big picture, because then there's some other big picture questions. But they uh, they decided it seems like what they've decided, although I don't know that they spelled it out explicitly, is they're going to forego the February launch opportunities. They're going to retarget for March, and I think the assumption we're making based on that is that they are not going to roll back immediately. They're going to stay at the pad, and that because that allows them to retarget for March. If subsequently they find something that would change their minds about rolling back, the I think if they were to just roll back right now, I'm not sure that they would have enough time to be ready in March. So, but they have this infrastructure that they've added after Artemis 1, the contingency pad access system in specifically, and a lot of the other hands-on work that they would probably be considering at this point are things that they have done in the past. And what they have now, though, is they have the ability to stay at the pad between these two launch periods, uh, do some limited set of uh, maintenance. And again, because it's the situation where it's the tail service mast umbilical is, and I can't, this is not, this is zoomed out too far, but it's basically the right. Let me see if I can do. Uh, but it's this one. It's the right hand tail service mast umbilical. That's the liquid hydrogen one. The liquid oxygen umbilical tail service mast umbilical is on the left, um, and so they have essentially have access to that. If y'all remember we were talking about the solid rocket booster hydrazine servicing, and there's some old renders of what it kind of looks like, and they have to set up risers on the mobile launcher deck to get up to the servicing ports on the solid rocket booster aft skirts. But it's similar to what they'll do here. They'll set up some access platforms so that they can physically inspect the umbilical interface between the ground side to vehicle side umbilical plates where those are mated, and then again, I'd say there's at least a decent chance that they're going to demate that umbilical and and do some inspections, replace this. Again, maybe they don't replace the seals, but I wouldn't be surprised if they do that. And but then remate it and get it, get it ready for another propellant loading and tanking sequence. And so, but yeah, that's the big picture. Is at least at least as far as we understand, and hopefully they will clarify, or we can get a clarification on that, or just to make sure that it's just explicit that they're going to stay at the pad. They're not going to roll back. But it just doesn't seem like there's enough time for them to roll back, um, do what they need to do in the VAB, and then come back out to the pad. And they would have to repeat that entire 2 weeks of countdown preps at the pad. So they'd have to set up the baskets again. They probably have to deservice the solid rocket booster hydrazine before they roll back, and then reservice them when they come back out to the pad. So, um, assuming they can stay at the pad, their to-do list is a little shorter, if not a lot shorter. And so that would mean if they stay at the pad, they don't have to reconfigure the emergency egress system. They could probably come. They could. The flight crew isn't obviously. They came out of quarantine last night, but they. I would not be surprised if they, whenever their next trip is here, that they do the countdown demonstration test part 2. That they'll do the walk down. They were going to have to do that at some point anyway. But I would not be surprised if that's somewhere in here in the month during February, that they come in and finish that, check off that box. But but yeah, it's there. I think right now they're looking at options for making changes to out at the pad, and this contingency pad access system. Let me see if I should be able to bring up that graphic again. But it's a set of platforms. They added some structural bracing to the mobile launcher umbilical tower, and I think somebody was saying it's not in the drawings. Let me bring up the drawing first. Um, but it could be or is similar to uh, the way that the crew access arm is supported, which is there's a support cable that attaches to it. That's then hooked up to that's also hooked up to the umbilical tower structure to provide additional support. Let me see if I can bring this up this way. But this isn't, this is not. So yeah, this is so again we're looking at this is the other side of the vehicle that faces the mobile launcher umbilical tower, and so you've got this platform. Again, this is, so we're looking at the vehicle kind of in reverse. So over here, this is the left-hand solid rocket booster. It's out of view, but this platform gives them access to the forward skirt, the access door on the forward skirt of the left-hand solid rocket booster to get access to those avionics and the flight termination system wire harnesses and equipment. And then this platform over here gives them access to both the right-hand solid rocket booster forward skirt and the north hand core stage umbilical, of course not core stage, the the north core stage inner tank access door. And so they have to go into both of those volumes. And then there's, again, this inside the inner tank, you have the main thrust beam that allows the SRBs to pick up the whole vehicle. And then you have a lot of crossover wire harnesses that connect the core stage and the boosters um, through the attach points. And so they will go into those and do this flight termination system retest. But this, I think, well, it will be interesting to see how they sequence those tests, or how they sequence this work with the repair work that they're talking about um, for the um, for the tail service mast umbilical. Again, I'm making assumptions. I just we'll see, but I'm assuming that this is not something that they can fix with software, for instance, or just purely be able to fix by changing procedures. But again, we'll have to see we'll have to see what their understanding is of the situation. So these platforms are not on the tower. The only thing, so this in this is this here is the core stage inner tank umbilical, and um, that is part of the mobile launcher. But these red, they're again, I'm not sure that they look red in real life, but you're again, even if this was just a wire drawing, a wireframe drawing, the idea is just to be able to visualize what this looks like. And so uh, there's, I think, they added some structural elements. They welded those into the mobile launcher umbilical tower. Um, and so they will, but again, we have not actually seen the real hardware. I think it's now we're going to see that. I hope. And so they'll lift those into place. And then again, so what I'm wondering here is like these are, you can see uh, these what look like uh, places where you would have a wire, like a cable hooked up. It's just not indicated necessarily in this render, but we will. I think we will see when they install these, because I think it's fairly certain that they're going to have to use these if they're going to stay out there uh, and try to make attempts in the March window. So yeah, these are they will be temporarily installed. I Unless there's something that comes up that that would um, where they would feel like they need to do some other maintenance work. I imagine it's possible that they could do, again, very limited maintenance work on the vehicle in those volumes for other reasons besides that. But I'm not sure they really want to do that. If there was something with the vehicle that where you needed access in other places, like with the ICPS, which is that's the SLS in space second stage, that would be more problematic. And then you'd be looking at, then you'd be talking about something like a rollback. But this is, I guess, unfortunately, something that they're at least familiar with how to do the hands-on maintenance. And then in terms of the hydrogen leak, this system is for resetting the flight termination system, because they knew that if they were going to stay out of the pad for an extended period, they would this would be something that they would be required to do. So the reason um, they just don't have enough time to make repairs, do another tanking test, and be ready and be ready to launch before the February period ends. So let me see if I can bring up the calendars, because that I guess is there's some value in that. Let's see. I gotta close this picture. I'll put this up while I'm fishing out the availability count, or one of the screenshots of the availability calendar. Let's see if this comes up. Okay. Okay. So um, so maybe if they worked as expeditiously as they did in the 2 weeks after they rolled out, maybe they could get to a tanking test done well, do the repairs, do whatever hands-on work they need to do, and do another tanking test, maybe somewhere out here at the end of next week. But you can see um, that's already past the point they they they're outside the window, and so there's they cannot they cannot do the they cannot make the repairs. And then there's once you quote unquote break the launch configuration for something, then you have to go do all of the verification and validation steps. So if they demate, if they disconnect the umbilical plates, when they remate them, they're going to have to do ambient temperature leak checks. They're going to have to revalidate the interfaces because, as I said, the that umbilical plate includes, um, I believe, includes uh, helium services, probably some electrical services, probably data services. So you have to go through and make sure that all of those work, because otherwise you hook the plates up, you go back into a tanking test, as fast as possible, and then like, oh, I'm not getting, I can't do helium, I can't flow helium. I'm not getting the data and I'm not getting the information through the interface that I want. So it's, the thing is that um, it's possible that that there is some level of urgency for doing a second wet dress rehearsal, just so that they don't give themselves, minimize the amount of time and flexibility that they have at the end of the month. But I think it's at the same time, you don't want to go too fast, and then end up having to repeat a whole bunch of intermediate steps. So, but we'll just have to see. I think, again, bigger picture, the reason that they decided to forego these attempts, which are just, they just have these three before the wet dress rehearsal. We got far into the wet dress rehearsal yesterday. Those were the three attempts that they had left, um, and it's just not. There's more work than I'm not sure. I guess a better way to put this is, I'm not sure how soon they could even conduct a second wet dress rehearsal. Um, I wouldn't be surprised if it's going to be even a little bit later than like Valentine's Day. It's probably going to be. It could be after that. It could be the week after that. So um, it's the only way. The only way that they were going to be able to launch in this window was if they had to make no changes of significance coming out of the test yesterday. So, and that obviously is not the case. So let me see if, but we're going to find out. We should get a significant amount of um, context today, hopefully, about what happened yesterday, what the at least perhaps more detail about what the plan is going forward for the rest of this month, maybe a little bit of sort of sequence of steps, what they're going to address first, um, because there's probably the flight termination system retest and the contingency pad access. There's probably kind of a window of time that they would that there's an earliest time that they can do that, that they could do that test, and but they would probably have more time and more flexibility since they're already at the pad, and they've all there's a lot of work that they've already completed that they don't necessarily need to repeat. And so um, that's, I mean, those are going to be some of the details that we're going to be looking for, is just in addition to troubleshooting that they still need to do, um, where some of these known uh, retests that they need to do, where do they arrange those on the schedule for the rest of this month? And and then we'll see. And I mean, I think the other thing is that because everybody's been working really hard, there's there's certainly an argument to be made that they need to that they need to let everybody catch their breath, and staying at the pad would give them, I think, will give them a more. It will be easier for them to do that. Let everybody get a little bit of rest and catch their breath, um, or at least more people do that anyway. But they're still, I suspect they're still going to be uh, pretty busy for the next, for the rest of the month and into March. So the that somebody's asking. Yes, I did. I did sleep for a little while. So but yeah, we we didn't. I didn't technically close the press site last night, but I was here. Um, they were nice enough to let me stay inside until we knew that they were done for the day, and that was somewhere around 12:30. And so, I just went back to the hotel, got some sleep, and came back, because there's still a lot of things going on here that we need to find out about, and then we obviously need to find out what's going to be the schedule for the rest of the week. It's probably going to be abbreviated now, but um, that's something else that I need to find out. But the yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. But again, we should have a much better idea. Well, we should have a better idea, I think, about about the situation and where things stand, after the news conference at 1. Um, there's, I'm hoping that there isn't as much of a schedule conflict. I know that one of the things that happened with the uh, pre-rollout briefing a couple of weeks ago was it ran right up against a pre-test briefing for the rollout, and so there's also a post-test briefing for the wet dress rehearsal, and I don't know where that is on the schedule, but um, I suspect there are going to be a lot of questions today, and so hopefully there is more time for questions um, in this briefing than there was at the pre-rollout briefing. So, but we'll see. I'm not sure if they've updated the people that are going to be at the briefing. If it's still going to be, there were a lot of most of the people on the list were either agency level leadership like Amit Shatria um, or exploration directorate leadership, and so you know it's 11. I don't know. I'm not sure when they got into detanking, and some people got off console, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's you know maybe 8 hours, maybe, probably not, considering to they decided to make they made that decision a lot quicker than I think I was expecting. So they basically decided, um, which also makes me wonder how much they how much they knew going into the terminal count. That I think maybe there's probably some awareness of proverbial writing on the wall before midnight last night, and so it just maybe became an academic exercise. Um, but we'll see who's available here. Hopefully, they have somebody. Uh, I would certainly be interested in talking with the guys on the integration console, but I have a feeling that they're trying to catch up on sleep this morning. So we'll just have to see who's available and what they can talk about. And it's also I would also be I also would not be surprised if some of the schedule and planning is still to be determined. So we'll just have to see we'll have to see what um, we'll have to see what we hear in about an hour and a half, or at least that's the schedule right now, and we'll just have to see. We'll see if that holds. But yeah, that's where we are right now. They're going to be troubleshooting the issues that they saw yesterday, coming up with plans to resolve those, and and then just general work plans for servicing and maintenance of the vehicle, and um, keeping it in a state so that it'll be ready to launch in the next window. um, uh, So yeah, I hopefully we will find out a decent amount. I mean, we definitely the big decision's already been made about which launch period they're targeting now. So now they're targeting launch period 18, but there's um, we'll just have to see. We'll just have to see what we'll just have to see. We'll have to see where they are. Maybe just a little bit more than 12 hours after they finished the test, and we may have to come back uh, subsequently or find out more subsequent to this news conference today. But at least at the very least, we'll get a little bit more. Um, will be a little bit better understanding of what happened and what they're thinking at this point. So I think, and so what I'll do here is, unless somebody has a question, um, I'll go through this again. But um, I mean, if anybody has a sort of last round of questions for the time being, what I'm thinking is that hopefully after this is hopefully after the briefing, but significantly after the briefing. So maybe towards the end of the day, uh, not midnight, but maybe towards the end of the day here, East Coast time. Um, I'll come back and take some more questions. I encourage you, if you have the time, to either watch the news conference, um, well, either watch it live, or catch the stream later. Just there, that's where sort of the raw information is going to be, and then we'll see what if there's anything else that we can get in the room, um, and then we'll, but hopefully at the end of the day, we'll have at least a little bit better idea about where things stand, um, and where NASA's going from here for Artemis 2. So, um, okay, good. So, but yeah, um, thanks everybody for hanging out for a little while, and we'll just, I think for the time being, this is kind of what I'm going to be able to do, which is just um, it's just hang out, let you know what I'm hearing, take questions, and then because we now have the better part of a month until the next opportunity, there will be time to sort of fall back into spending time reviewing the news of the week, and being able to do the more regular videos. But probably for probably for this week, we're still going to be doing mostly live streams. There's still a decent amount of real time. There's still more of a real time feed of information than than uh, than we've seen for the last 2 years. So yeah, unless there's and so yeah, if you have any other questions, just hang on to those for a few hours, and I'll come back. I'll come back at the end of the day, and we'll see where we are, basically. But um, again, thanks for tuning in, and I will see you guys next time.